Idea Factory in 2017, 2018 is going to take a new direction. We've been running this initiative now for 3 years, and we really feel like it is time to sort of expand our footprints, both institutionally but also regionally. The way we decided to do this was to identify a common theme that we were going to propose for the year's talks, and allow all of our speakers to propose presentations that can address or deal with that particular theme. So we spent some time going back and forth on what would be the best place to start, and we came up with this one. Our theme for 2017-2018 is going to be walls. We are putting out a call for proposals regionally, and I wanted to share just a little bit of highlights from the call for proposals because we could actually use your help with this. If you have connections in any kind of humanistic, social sciences, communication, artistic community here in the Detroit area, and especially at the universities or colleges, we want them to know that we are accepting these proposals. So it's still in draft stages, but I will be posting on the website and sending a link around down the road. The other thing, really quickly, before I get too far, we're also starting an Idea Factory email list. We haven't done this yet, where we have exclusive Idea Factory emails. So if you would like to be on our list, we won't spam you, but you will then get direct Idea Factory information. Please put your names and emails on this. If you could circulate that, just send it around. That'd be great. So, what are we thinking about when we think about walls? Really what we wanted to do is explore the ideas of walls as being dialectical objects. That is to say, walls are not singular, they're multiple, and we're looking at all the possible ways in which human beings, societies, cultures, civilizations engage with and think about walls. So in our call for proposals, we're looking at these kind of dialectical oppositions that walls present to us. Walls unite. We are in this space right now thanks to these walls. We have this kind of opportunity to make this sort of learning community because of these walls. But they also exclude, right? They support. Thank God for the walls right now, or else the ceiling would be falling in our head, right? They do some really good and important work. But they also divide. Right? And we can think of all the ways in which walls create divisions among people. They persist. I'm thinking here of the fact that walls often outlast their intended uses. And actually the image that I started with was a wall that was built in Detroit in the 1940s by a developer deliberately to separate a black neighborhood from a new, potentially white neighborhood in order to secure funding, right? So even though that barrier socially and culturally doesn't exist in that space anymore, that wall is still there as a reminder of that intention. So they persist, but they also rapidly transform. We can think about new walls coming up, walls coming down, urban development as a kind of constant process of fluctuation and change. Finally, they internalize and they externalize. They create insides and outsides, members of a community and those who are excluded from the community. In this way, as I was actually crafting this proposal, I was thinking about walls as being like concept objects, right? They're both ideas, they project ideas, they persist as ideas, they present ideas, but they're also very much material. And that was another thing we were thinking about as we were trying to identify a theme. Given the nature of our institutional identity as a technological university, walls are really a very early form of technology, right? A very important kind of technology. And so that was our rationale for proposing this concept. I won't read all the possible topics. This was me just kind of brainstorming all the different ways that we can approach walls. But our plan is this. We're going to continue with the model of 3 talks per semester. Our hope is to seduce 4 outside speakers from the region to come and talk about their work as it relates to this broad theme. And we're asking them to interpret it imaginatively, right? So we're not just thinking about physical walls here. We can also be thinking about barriers to access in society, or emotional walls that people build, or psychological walls, so using it metaphorically as well. We are going to be offering a small and modest honorarium to compensate them for their time. We still need to identify all the sources of that funding, so we're kind of taking a leap, and hopefully that won't be a barrier for the project to unfold as we intended to. And then if all goes as planned, the final speaker in the spring, which is kind of the slot that Dan's filling for us right now, might actually involve something that would be a little larger, perhaps a symposium or a day-long conference of sorts. That's still in the works, but I wanted to let you know where we are going. And as I say, as you see this call for proposals finally being circulated, and we're going to circulate it as broadly as we can, please forward it on to your friends, colleagues, students in other institutions, and get the word out there. So we're really excited to move forward with idea factoring this way, and we think that the time is right to do that. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Phil Boat, who is going to introduce today's speaker, and we will go from there.
Okay, everyone, thanks for coming today. It's really an honor and a pleasure to introduce my excellent colleague, Dr. Dan Shar. Dan joined Lawrence Tech in 2015. He earned his doctorate in philosophy from the City University of New York Graduate Center. Dan works in the philosophy of mind and cognitive science. His research primarily focuses on emotions, drawing on psychology and neuroscience, as well as traditional philosophical tools. His other philosophical interests include moral psychology and consciousness. The title of his presentation today is Emotions and the Sources of Moral Judgment.
So thank you, Phil, thank you, Paul, and also Franco and the broader Delogu team, the expanding Delogu team. So let me get started. So this talk is part of a interdisciplinary field that I've been approaching in the last year or so that has really been building steam both in the empirical sciences, psychology, neuroscience, cognitive science, but also in traditional armchair disciplines like philosophy over the last 15 years. Basically, the question is, what is the psychological basis of moral judgment? So moral judgment is a topic for the students in the room, think back to your foundations classes, and moral judgment and the nature of moral judgment is a major issue for Plato and Aristotle back in ancient Greece. But there's a lot of contemporary research on what are the psychological processes at play in moral judgment, and also what is the neuro basis of those processes. Often these discussions go back to a problem that's probably familiar to some, but maybe not all of you, the trolley problem. So let me start with the original scenario that was described by Philippa Foot. So imagine, and this image is a little grainy, I realize. So imagine there's a trolley going down a track, and the brakes on the trolley are malfunctioning. And ahead of the track, you've got 5 people who, if the trolley driver does nothing at all, those 5 people are going to die. Okay, so that's the baseline expectation, 5 people die. Now the trolley driver has a choice. The driver can't stop the trolley, but the trolley driver can switch the trolley to the alternate track, taking this one person who initially was in no danger at all, and suddenly putting that person in terrible danger, and in fact guaranteeing that this other person dies. Okay? So this is, you can call it the driver scenario. So we're putting ourselves in the perspective of the driver of the trolley. So let me just pause here and ask you guys, do you think that it would be right for the trolley driver to switch from the track where he or she would kill 5 people to the track where he or she would kill 1 person? Is that the right thing to do? Well, okay, I'm gonna set it up so you have to do one or the other. You have to say yes or no, okay? So do you say yes? Okay, we've got a bunch of yeses. How about no? Do you say no, that it's not the right thing to do? Okay, so we've got some ambivalent people and some people who don't follow instructions.
Or newcomers.
Okay, so let's change the scenario a little bit. instead of focusing on the driver, we're talking about a third person. So this is someone who knows everything that's taking place and has one thing that he or she can do to change the scenario, which is flip a switch. The only difference between this scenario and this scenario is it's not the trolley driver, it's a bystander who has the ability to flip a switch. Okay, so I'll do the same type of survey. Is it right for the bystander to flip a switch? Is it, okay, who says it's not right for the bystander to flip a switch? Okay, we still have one persistent person. So has anyone changed their mind at all? Is anyone say yes here, but either say no or maybe not here? Does anyone see a moral difference? Okay. Does anyone want to share what might be a moral difference between the driver and the switch scenarios? Anyone have in mind what might be a moral difference?
Well, in the first example, the driver, he's definitely more experienced in the terms of the dynamics of how the track works and everything, and would know the consequences and everything. The bystander's kind of pushed right into that scenario without really.
Okay, so you might say the driver has more expertise, more knowledge, so there might be uncertainty, possibility for error. So that's one thing to take into account.
Does the person at the switch know that the trolley can't stop?
Yeah, so here's the funny thing with philosophical thought experiments is there's often lots of kind of additional stuff that it's possible to add in, but philosophers try to keep it neat and tidy in a way that is often somewhat artificial to make the kind of the philosophical issue more direct. So to make it more tidy, let's pretend that the driver and the person at the switch both have perfect information about the situation. Everyone has perfect information. Everyone knows what the two options are, and everyone knows the consequences of each of these two options.
But how about the relatives or friends over there?
So what about them? Oh, so are you asking what will the relatives of these
the
people?
one who is going to die is their friends or relatives.
Oh, okay. So is so actually, I actually just read this today that there was a university that had an ethics exam in I think 1905 that had a version of this, but it was just one person, and the one person was a child of the trolley driver. So, and there's lots of different versions. So there's a whole Facebook page of Trolley Problem memes. So it's like, what if like Kanye's here and Rihanna is over here? So there's like lots of different manipulations and alternatives. But you can start to see the question. I mean, so one thing that some people say is the trolley driver is responsible in virtue of being a trolley driver. So it's already the trolley driver's problem. Some people would say it's not this bystander's problem unless the bystander makes it his or her problem. Whereas other people would say, well, you're there, you have the power. So therefore, the fact that you have the power, that makes it your problem. So that's already one major philosophical disagreement about the scenario. Let me add one more scenario, which is kind of the most contentious and dramatic. So instead of switching the trolley onto another track where it hits one person, you are up on this footbridge, or imagine someone else is up on this footbridge. The way that you can stop the trolley is by shoving a large individual over a footbridge onto the track where that person's body would have sufficient inertia, I'll say, to stop the trolley from hitting the other people. So one might say that the calculation is the same because the choice in all three of these is between 1 and 5. 1 life and 5 lives. So some philosophers would say that if you choose switching the track here, you should choose switching the track here. And if you choose switching the track here, you should endorse pushing the large individual over the edge of the footbridge. Does anyone want to get off board? Is there a moral difference that anyone can identify between the footbridge and the switch?
The difference is the person is like stuck on the track in those two scenarios. So either way, it's like 1 or 5. In that scenario, it's 5. Like if you push someone off that bridge, that person was not part of the equation before you made them part of it. At that point, it's a morally wrong issue, not the lesser of two evils.
Okay, so you're saying that this person is already in some sense in harm's way by being here, and this person would have expected, like, hey, I just came to, I don't know, whatever reason the person was on the footbridge. Like, I didn't put myself in danger. How dare you put me in danger? Okay. Any other responses to this?
I mean, it could be a completely different scenario if the person who is being thrown over that bridge is volunteering to do that to save the lives of the other people.
Well, right. Actually, so another version is to say, well, if you're going to push a large person, what if you are that large person? Are you obligated to jump off? Okay? Because there are very few people, obviously, who would actually voluntarily jump off to stop the trolley themselves with their own body.
And I'm surprised you say that. I thought we should assume that every individual would willingly lay down their life to save 5 others, and that each of the individuals who would die alone wants our help.
Right. Well, so there's a would and then a should. So maybe you would say that we should be willing to do that, but I think psychologically, unless you're like the person in a war zone who's been like trained, like if the moment comes, jump on the grenade. Like that's one of those scenarios where that kind of heroism is not necessarily expected, but almost expected. But an ordinary person, I think most of us don't expect each other to do that.
Yeah, I know the whole situation's a grenade, but
Yeah.
but the conflict and the moral conflict is the value of life is not necessarily quantitative. There's also the 1 against 5 ignores qualitative, and we don't know what those 5 people are, or the values. So and that's why I can't vote on it. But
Right.
moving it from the arena of philosophy into reality, that decision was made probably more times than we want to know in the Holocaust, where a group of people would be hiding and a mother with a babe in arms
Right.
that would begin to cry would suffocate her child rather than expose the entire group.
Right.
And that's when these dilemmas are more complex than we want to grapple with, maybe.
Right, and so the issue that you raise also of putting a value to human life is something that on one hand seems like fundamentally objectionable to a lot of people, but then there's a lot of public policies in which we implicitly are doing that. And it's hard to know what the alternative to implicitly doing that is. So it puts policymakers into very murky and problematic moral territory. I saw your hand.
Well, this more comes from looking at the way the picture is set up. The guy on the footbridge looks like he's looking down at the people.
Right.
So my only thought is maybe he was the one that set up the experiment and you're saving the people from this tyrannical guy. Like,
Yeah. Well, yeah. So this is the classic move to say, how dare you present me with these 2 horrible alternatives? I want to create a better option, which is I get to push the villain over, and if I get to push the villain over, then everyone's happy, or everyone is happy.
Just to clarify the experiment too, are we talking about morally obligated or morally acceptable?
Yeah. So that matters, and I was asking you guys the question of right and wrong, kind of to simplify, but I think a lot of people think that there is a difference between what is obligatory and what is permissible. So it might be that some things are obligatory, so you have to do this. But then there's maybe a whole range where multiple different choices are permissible, but without any of them being obligatory. So I think, yeah, if I had phrased the question in terms of, is it permissible for the person to do it, then at least in these two categories, that might have changed people's behavior. I think with this one, well, actually, I didn't actually do the survey. Okay, how about, does anyone think it's obligatory to push the person over the bridge in this case? Morally, okay, we have one person says it's morally obligatory, okay? Does anyone say it is permissible, up to obligatory, but at least permissible morally to push the person over the bridge? Okay, yeah, so there is a massive difference in how people respond to this and this, okay? And so by the way, to kind of give this a Lawrence Techie twist, so there's an article that stood out to me when I saw this headline a year ago. So there's a big issue with self-driving cars. So self-driving cars are potentially in trolley problem situations all the time. I mean, all of us are when we drive, theoretically, if there's a possibility of avoiding an accident that might create another accident. So Mercedes-Benz has solved the trolley problem, and their solution is save their passengers, okay? And they have the explanation or rationalization that if they save their passengers, they know, or at least they think they know, they can do that. Whereas the people out there, well, those people aren't inside the car, so we don't know the consequences of our actions for the people out there, whereas we have better knowledge of our consequences for the people inside the car. So keep that in mind in the year 2025 when you're sharing the highway with autonomous Mercedes-Benz vehicles, that it's better to be inside the vehicle than outside.
So do yourself a bends, really.
Yeah. Okay. So that's how this is starting to apply to like the emerging field of autonomous cars. But let's get into the psychology and neuroscience a little bit. Actually, no. Let me get deeper into the philosophy. Okay. So there are two major ethical theories that you're going to discuss in any ethics class. One is consequentialism. So consequentialism says always choose the action with the best consequences. Now, what makes an action have best consequences? That is going to depend a lot theory to theory. But often consequentialists have the idea that you can put a numerical figure on goodness and a numerical figure on badness, and subtract the badness from the goodness to end up with a number. So you can, maybe you wouldn't do this in practice, but at least in theory you can do this. So if you're choosing between 2 or 3 options, you do the math for each of these options, and you decide whichever option has the highest, either positive or, if they're all negative, at least the highest negative value, that's the one you choose. So in this case, should you push the person over the bridge? Yes, because 5 lives is greater than 1. So you should save more lives. So that's the kind of the straightforward consequentialist interpretation of the case. Another general type of theory, deontology, is focused on following moral rules. So the deontological perspective is always follow the relevant moral rules. Now, this gets more complicated because what are the relevant moral rules? That's going to vary a lot from theory to theory. And another major question is, do the moral rules ever conflict with each other? So Kant said they wouldn't, many other people say they would. But in this kind of case, there might be a moral rule that's relevant to this situation along the lines of don't kill people, okay? In which case, you shouldn't push the person over the bridge because you shouldn't kill people.
The question in my mind is why not that person just simply jump over? Why he wants to push another person to get down?
Right.
That's
Yeah.
my question.
Yeah. So that is a problem for.
If he just simply want to save
Yeah.
people, then why you want to sacrifice another person?
You can solve the problem by saying that the large individual isn't watching. The large individual, if the large individual has his back turned, he doesn't see those 5 people. So that's the way to solve it. Like you're not placing the.
Oh, to say that the agent, the moral agent, isn't like, let's say, oh, I wish that I could jump in and do it myself, but I'm not big enough.
And
So,
the big person
unfortunately-
isn't watching.
And the big person, yes.
The big person isn't watching.
Or maybe the big person is making the wrong choice, and you have to help that person make the right choice. So yeah, it's a problematic situation. But yeah, you're right that is that.
In that case, you say, you'll thank me for this later.
Yeah.
How about Trump is one of them.
Right. Yeah. Well. Yeah. So I'm sure that there's some Trump variations of these trolley problems. If you Google that trolley problem Trump, I'm sure you'll find something. Okay. So that's a deontological interpretation of this case. Whereas it's worth keeping in mind that a consequentialist will say that all 3 of the scenarios that I've described are fundamentally equivalent because the math is fundamentally equivalent. Whereas a deontologist is likely to see moral differences between the 3 cases.
Yeah, so to do a simple variation on this for the consequentialist, suppose the doctor has just had a terrible day. The first 4 patients who came in all need transplants.
Yeah.
And the transplant market is such that there's no hope for them.
Yeah.
And the 5th patient walks in, and he's got 2 healthy kidneys and a healthy heart and a healthy lung.
Yeah.
And he has to be put under anesthetic for some other reason.
Yeah.
But wouldn't it be convenient to transplant the 2 kidneys and the heart and the lung to the 4 patients he saw that morning and save 4 lives at the cost of only 1 life?
Yeah, no, that's a really nice case. So if you're a consequentialist, you have to either accept that advice that the doctor should do that, or if you don't want to say that the doctor should do that, you have to do some fancy theoretical footwork to explain why you don't get that conclusion. Because at least at face value, the consequentialist math is going to tell you that it's a better option. Yeah. And there's basically there are, on one hand, the positive features of consequentialism are pretty straightforward. Aren't good outcomes better than bad outcomes? And aren't better outcomes better than less good outcomes? It kind of seems obvious when you look at it that way that consequentialism is right, but then it's very easy to create perverse cases like that where it's very hard to support the consequentialist line. Okay, so here are these 2 kind of theoretical traditions, and I'm framing them very broadly. I'm not trying to pin any particular philosopher to either of them. So there's a question: can we give a psychological analysis of the judgments people make when they make either consequentialist or deontological judgments? Can we psychologically analyze the moral judgment? Okay, so that's what a number of people have been trying to do recently. Most famously, Josh Green. So Josh Green is the kind of the most cited person in this field. So the early work that he did in 2004 is basically put someone into a brain scanning machine and observe which parts of the brain are relatively more active. And what we're comparing is the footbridge case to the switch case, where the rationale is when people are in the footbridge case, almost everyone is going to respond the way that almost all of you responded, namely to say, my God, no, you can't do that. Whereas with the switch case, a significant number of people in this case say, yes, it's right, or at least permissible to do the switch. So it seems like when you take a lot of ordinary people, or at least college undergraduates in intro psych, and put them in a brain scanner with these scenarios, they seem to make a a deontological judgment about the footbridge case, but a consequentialist judgment about the switch case. So the question is, how can we understand that? Let me say what he found. So there are two main areas that lit up in response to the footbridge case. So one is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is, so ventral means low, medial means middle, and we're talking about the prefrontal cortex. So it's kind of like, basically right here, just a little bit in your forehead. So, and the amygdala, which are kind of two almond-shaped things dangling in the middle of your brain, those both lit up, and they're both implicated in emotions. And there's a whole wide range of research showing that these areas play a role in producing emotions. Whereas with the switch case, it's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, so adjacent to the ventromedial, but significantly different in terms of the role it seems to play in the brain. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is implicated more in, so I use the label cognitive control. Another label that's often used is executive function. But basically, think about a case where you have a complicated situation and you need to figure out what to do. And you're trying to kind of juggle a bunch of tasks or a bunch of pieces of information. It seems like this part of the brain is responsible for that kind of cognitive, basically keeping you on whatever task you need to be on. Okay? So it seems that this part of the brain is more active in the switch case, and these parts of the brain are more active in the footbridge case. So what are the implications of that? Well, what Green says is we should theorize that there are two systems involved. There is a emotional system and a rational system. This should say rational. What can we say about the emotional system? So this is based on kind of a wide variety of converging research. He says it operates relatively automatic, rapid, non-conscious in those brain areas, and he says it explains deontological judgment because, after all, this is the brain area that is more active in the cases where people are making the deontological judgments. So ironically, these rule-based judgments of don't kill people, I need to follow the moral rule, Green says, actually these are driven by the emotional system. Okay. Then what about the rational system? This is a typo here. Based on a variety of converging evidence, which I'll discuss a little bit more, this is deliberate, slow, conscious. Again, it's in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And Green says that this explains consequentialist judgment. Now let me kind of explain a little bit how he explains the contrast between how we respond to these two cases. So let's start with the footbridge case, okay? So the emotional system, when it's presented with the footbridge case, is just like screaming, bad, 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 okay? In response to imagining pushing someone over the bridge, or imagining someone else pushing someone over the bridge. Meanwhile, the rational system says 5 is greater than 1, okay? So in this case, the emotional system is screaming loudly enough that it wins the internal fight. Okay? However, in the footbridge case, the rational system is going to do the same thing. 5 is greater than 1. But emotionally, there's not anything that's as viscerally, emotionally weighted about flipping a switch to have a trolley turn compared to actually physically pushing someone off of a bridge. So that's what Green is saying, that it is more emotionally powerful and more emotionally troubling to imagine pushing someone over a bridge than to imagine flipping a switch, even if in some sense the consequences of those actions are equivalent. So therefore, in this case, the emotional system sends a more subtle signal rather than an overwhelming signal. And therefore, many people, in many people, the rational system wins. Questions at this point?
So it sounds like you're implying that the deontological choice is driven by the more primitive part of the brain?
Yes, yes. And this is, so he had, I'm trying to remember his like ironic paper title about this. He basically has a paper where he's making fun of Kant for like secretly being emotional, because Kant is, in the history of philosophy, kind of presented as the epitome of ultra-rigid rationality. But Kant is also the uber deontologist. So what Green would say is that what Kant is doing is taking his emotional responses and creating extremely elaborate rationalizations for what his emotions are telling him to do.
Again, because once we identify something as primitive, we've admitted it's wrong.
Well, at least that's what Green wants to do. So Green's own, so he has his psychological agenda, which is to describe the phenomenon. He also has a moral agenda, which is his recent book, which is what he's more into these days, is to say, here's my psychological story, and we have this problem of different cultures that don't know how to get along with each other because they have conflicting moral rules that they live by. How can we solve this problem of conflicting moral rules that are situated in people's history and culture, so on and so forth? Green's solution is consequentialism. Now, I think that this is, I wasn't convinced, because it doesn't seem likely that you can convince people to give up their moral values in exchange for consequentialism. But Green thinks that it is the more advanced, using the more advanced parts of the brain way to form a moral judgment. Other questions or thoughts?
It occurs to me that I'm thinking back over all the wars that we have in world history, and in every one, the enemy is portrayed as less valuable than we. That life unworthy of life.
Right.
But not just that, they're flat out wrong, their morality is wrong, their lifestyle is wrong, everything is wrong, and therefore we have a moral right, if not obligation, to extinguish that.
Right, so how are you thinking about that in terms of these?
Well, it's a rationalization of emotion.
Oh, okay. So yeah. So I see what you're getting at. So emotionally, there's some imperative through either hatred or selfishness or whatever to, do harm to others. So what you do is you create a rationalization that is going to trick the rational system into saying it's okay, because otherwise, the math would tell you you can't exploit those other people. But if you can say each one of them is worth less than one, then maybe you're not going to allow yourself to do it. Yeah. I saw another.
Oh, I was just wondering, and I hate to ask this question, but did they look at women versus men?
Oh, I'm sure that they have, and I just can't recall whether there's a significant difference. But yeah, that would be interesting to see whether in trolley problems in general or any of these other things there's a gender difference or a sex difference. I'm not sure. Yeah.
I think the big difference between the two is the footbridge. It turns the person into an object, so it's very objectifying and very dehumanizing. Whereas the second one kind of values human life more because you're placing more value on 5 than 1.
I see what you're saying. So, and this is actually an objection that some philosophers have made to say that the problem with the footbridge is that and it's actually kind of Kantian in a somewhat complicated way, to say that you're using the person as an object to stop a train, and there's something wrong about using someone's body, which has dignity, value, as a mere object to stop a train, whereas the person dies the same way, but it's not as undignified or as disrespectful to just steer a train to kill them. Whereas a consequentialist would say, you know, give me a break, they die either way. So you can see how the two sides go.
On that same point, though, has Green done work on combat, post-traumatic stress disorder? Do you know?
Oh.
Because this dual process view, I remember there were folks at Case Western who were working on combat and violence, and this whole human as object versus human as agent thing.
Yeah.
They have noted in soldiers coming from combat because it actually sort of like crosses the two systems, as it were.
Right, and that to train people to kill people, you have to I can't say this with authority, but
right.
Theoretically you're training people to treat at least some other people as objects.
Situations in which the emotional deontological system would be sending strong negative signals, whether through exposure or training, that negative signal gets repressed. I mean, it has to.
That's interesting. So either people with PTSD or just people who have gone through routine training.
Right.
Okay, so let me just briefly describe some of the evidence that Green cites to support his view. So one study that he and some colleagues did is showing that extra cognitive load, so basically if you're making someone do something that's cognitively difficult at the same time that they're doing one of these tasks, it slows the consequentialist but not deontological judgments. So why would this be? Well, part of the story is that the deontological judgments are based on the emotional system, and the emotional system on these theories is rapid, automatic, parallel, whereas the consequentialist system uses basically the fancy new parts of the brain, and one of the downsides of the fancy new parts of the brain is that they tend to be slower, more deliberate, more serial rather than parallel. So it's easier to kind of to slow down the consequentialist judgment because it's relying on parts of the brain that are less parallel. Okay. Another study, so VMPFC patients, what I mean there is people who have damage to their VMPFC, so people who have lesions in that area, tend to make more consequentialist judgments. Okay. So that, again, is making a strong connection between, well, if this part of the brain is associated with people making the deontological judgments, it makes sense that that damage to that part of the brain would lead to more consequentialist judgments. And additionally, there's a lot of literature making the connection between this part of the brain and emotions in particular. So that would also, if you kind of credit that research, strengthen the case that emotions are normally the thing that stops us from making consequentialist judgments. And then some quick other psychological evidence, not neuroscience, psychology. So this is a really fun study where people were hypnotized to have a feeling of disgust in response to otherwise banal words like the word still. If they read the word still in a story, it makes them feel disgusted. And that causes people to make a more severe moral judgment in a story that has a word that makes them feel disgusted. So that's making the parallel between a negative emotion like disgust and harsh moral judgment. And here, amusement seems to lead to consequentialist judgment, even on the footbridge case. Why would that be? Well, if normally the reason we don't make the consequentialist judgment on the footbridge case is because we're horrified by the footbridge case, if you're already amused going into it, the amusement going into it might decrease the horror when you actually hear the story, or you might kind of take it as a joke rather than take it seriously. So therefore, you might not have the horror that people normally feel, the emotional horror, and therefore say, okay, 5 is greater than 1. Okay. How are we doing? Okay. Let me speed up. Okay. Now I'm going to give you another perspective. So this next bit of the talk is inspired by work by Fiery Cushman, who's actually a frequent collaborator of Josh Green's, but he has a different spin on some of the same research. So he distinguishes model-based learning versus model-free learning, and this is not his own terminology. This is based on a lot of literature in psychology and neuroscience identifying these two systems. So I'm going to briefly describe what these two systems are and how they're understood to operate. So model-based learning, as I say, you judge the value of a potential action. So is this action going to be good or not based on the expected outcome, and you judge the expected outcome based on a causal model of the system. So in your mind, you have a causal model that if this happens, then this will happen, then this will happen. And whatever, based on your model, you'll judge whether the outcome is going to be good or not. So in the moral domain, you could imagine overhearing people have a problematic conversation. And then your question is, should I report what I've heard? And you might ask yourself, well, what will happen if I report what I've heard? And you would have to tell yourself if this happens, then that would happen story of, well, if I tell the person what I just heard, then they are likely to do this. And if they do this, then they're likely to do that. So you have to use a model of the people involved and of the social structures involved to decide, should I do anything about the information I've just overheard? So that's a case where you're using your model-based learning system to decide what to do in this ethical case. And more generally, the positives of this kind of system is it's potentially very accurate. If you've got a good model, you can give a good estimate of the outcome of your actions. Negatives, well, using this type of model is slow, and also you need a lot of information to build it up. So if you're in a brand new situation and you don't yet have a causal model of what's going on in the situation, then you aren't going to know what to do at first. You have to build a causal model before you can do anything. Okay? On the other hand, model-free learning. So this is a neurologically older type of learning system where you judge the value of a potential action based on positive and negative reinforcement adjusted for prior errors in estimated value. Well, okay, what does that mean? Well, imagine that you're in a certain situation and you want to know, would this action be good or bad? What you do is, in every given situation you find yourself in every type of situation, you keep a running tally. Is this type of action good or bad? So let's say I'm in competition with one of my peers for some resource. Should I just grab it? Okay? I have to keep a running tally in my mind. Does grabbing it lead to good outcomes or bad outcomes? Not based on a causal model of, well, the outcome would be good because this, or the outcome would be bad because this. You just keep a running tally of, has it been working for me to do this type of action? And what happens is, over time, you form an estimate in your mind of the expected positive or negative value of a given type of action. And when the outcome was better than expected, then you learn, okay, this is better than I thought. When the outcome was worse than expected, you learn that it's worse than you thought. Well, how would this work for moral learning? Well, I have a kid in daycare, and in daycare, you need to learn a lot about how to deal with peers over competing for resources. So you need to learn, what do you do if I want something and someone else wants something? Do I pull it away from them? You know, what are the nice ways to touch people and what are the not nice ways to touch people? And arguably, the type of learning that my son is doing in daycare might build up to leading to the consequence of, hopefully, when he's an adult, he will not believe that it's okay to push people off of, footbridges or other ones. Okay? So arguably, he is doing model-free learning now of the sort that would eventually cause him, in a model-free way, to be horrified at the idea of just shoving someone. Okay? So it's not based on well, if I shove someone, it would be bad, or if I shove someone, I would get in trouble. If I shove someone, that could alienate them in the future. It's shoving in this type of situation is bad, full stop, okay? Because I've learned that shoving is bad, full stop. So the positives, this type of system is fast and immediately useful because you can start collecting data immediately. Anytime you do an action in a situation, you're already collecting data, even if you don't have a model of how the situation works. All you need to do is start acting and observing the consequences. Downside, well, this is a little complicated, but sometimes the very same action type might be good in one type of case, but bad in another type of case. And this type of learning system does a bad job of figuring out when the very same type of action could either have good or bad consequences, because it's storing a value for a type of action. So how does Fiery Cushman explain this? Well, he says, in the switch, instead of talking about the emotional system and the rational system, we should describe what the model-free system says and what the model-based system says. The model-free system, in the switch case, I guess I flipped this compared to before, says, well, what about flipping switches? Have I learned that flipping switches is bad? I haven't learned that flipping switches is bad. So therefore, I'm not going to have a strong negative association with flipping switches in my model-free associative system. But my model-based system has a model of the consequences of flipping the switch. And my model-based system tells me the consequences are good. Okay? Down here, what about the footbridge? Do I have, using my model-free system, any stored value for pushing strangers off of objects? Well, maybe not pushing strangers off of objects, but ever since I was a child, I learned that pushing is bad and being pushed is bad. So therefore, it doesn't matter what the outcome is. My model-free system is telling me, don't push people. Don't push people into danger, okay? And again, my model-based system has a causal model of the situation that tells me 5 is greater than 1. But in this case, my model-free system is able to compete with the model-based system with a different answer. So what Cushman is doing is saying, actually, this whole emotion versus reason thing, which is a very convenient shorthand, might not be the right description of the situation. It's more sophisticated to use the types of categories that people who are actively doing the neuroscience research use. So the model-free versus model-based, that's the kind of more cutting-edge way of describing what's going on as we learn what to do. Okay, I'm going to quickly wrap up so I can take a couple questions, even though I've had some questions in the middle. Is model-based learning emotional? Well, clearly it's not necessarily emotional because any one of you who are doing any sort of theoretical work are using models of the things that you study, okay? So you can have a model of a moral situation, but you can also have a model of a kind of morally neutral situation, like how do chemicals work, or anything like that. What about model-free learning? Is model-free learning fundamentally emotional? Again, I would say no, and this might be more controversial. And actually, I had the good fortune to meet Josh Green and argue with him about this at a recent conference. And I said model-free learning is not fundamentally emotional. So here's my example. So on my commute, I go from highway to highway to highway, and I often forget which highway I'm on, but I don't get lost, okay? Because I know that at some point I'll see a sign, and when I see a sign, I'll know what to do, and I'll even know what lane to be in, even though I don't know why I need to be in that lane. I just know, okay, here I am. When I'm here, I go into that lane. When I'm here, I go into that lane. So I don't have a map in my head that I'm referring to decide what to do. I'm using my model-free system to decide, how to manipulate the highways of Michigan, okay? And I think that there's a lot of things that we do like that where there aren't necessarily any emotions implicated in these stories, but we're doing model-free processes that are important for making decisions. So here's a very simple model. How do emotions relate to both model-based and model-free systems? Well, model-based and model-free systems often lead to action where emotions aren't even involved. But another thing that they do is they sometimes have emotions as outputs. So if my model-based learning system tells me that I'm in grave danger, I'm going to be afraid. If my model-free system tells me I'm in grave danger, I'm going to be afraid. Or you could say a different thing. If either of these systems tells me that I'm about to be faced with a grievous insult, I'm going to become angry. Well, how else do emotions relate to these systems? Well, when I'm angry, temporarily, my model-based and model-free systems are going to be processing in a different way. I am temporarily going to be more tolerant of risks and more likely to hold people responsible for ambiguous actions. Whereas if I'm sad or I'm afraid, I'm going to operate in a different mode with my model-based or model-free systems. So how do they relate? It's not that either of these systems is emotion, it's that each of these systems has emotion as an output, and emotion modulates the behavior of each of these systems. And in the interest of time, I will leave it at that. Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, so I was just wondering, is it possible to think about combining the model-free and model-based approaches in the sense that I can imagine a situation in which you might learn from childhood or have certain experiences that condition you, and that would be sort of learning in model-free style, right?
Yeah.
And then that model-free style, eventually as you grow and you gather more experiences, could that kind of form itself into a model such that you would then be operating as an adult on a more model-based system when that model itself had its roots in a model-free learning style?
Right, so for those of you who either are currently in foundations or will take foundations in the future, that's a very kind of Aristotelian way of describing world development, that you start with habit and you go from habit to having eventually theoretical understanding. So I'm actually not sure about the specific story that you told, but actually you're totally right that it's more complicated, that it's not one or the other necessarily, that it actually can even be a question of which causal model should I use? Well, my model-free system via association tells me which causal model is relevant in a certain situation. And it can work the other way too, where I have a causal model of the situation, but how do I know what the outcomes are? Well, you can use, I guess this actually is what you were saying. You can use your model-free system to train up your model-based system to know what outcomes are good and what outcomes are bad. Yeah, so the more sophisticated story, and this is something that neuroscientists are still kind of in the early days of explaining, is that the interactions between these systems can be, and the mutual dependencies can be quite elaborate.
We're using exactly that, and I mean, we have for years. My kids went through, Mr. Stranger Danger programs at school,
right,
and the policemen coming in, and so that you're trained in model-based learning,
right,
how these systems work and how you're supposed to respond in the best possible way. And now newer programs are training kids for how to respond to bullying,
right,
how to respond to things that they read on social media about potential threats of violence to others or to self.
right.
And it seemed to me as I was listening to this that all of this is being incorporated in our training of young minds for positive outcomes, they can also be used for training of anyone's minds for negative.
Right, right. And so it sounded like what you were describing was, as you said, model-based. So tell people, in this situation, here is your model of the best way to escape from danger or to get about a good outcome if there's a conflict. The tricky thing is you've simultaneously got your model-free system, which tells you if there's a bully, either like appease the bully or run away or whatever it is that your model-free system has been.
Push the little kid over the bridge.
Right, we're right.
The bully.
Whatever it is that, depending on your own life experience, the model-free system has taught you is the right thing to do. So if you only focus on the model-based system, you might end up not shaping behavior. So that's a tricky thing because it's much trickier to come in at the end and tell the model-free system what to do, because the model-free system has been busy accumulating data your entire life. So it's not as easy to just say, ignore all the stuff you've learned your entire life about what actions are good and bad. Yeah.
So actually, my question falls on, I have two questions,
Yeah.
but they're kind of different. The first question though, and I don't want to ask the system you've model, the theory you've elaborated here to do too much work, but I am wondering is, with the model-based versus model-free approach, is it just a matter of which system has the relative force in any given moment that determines the outcome? Like I'm thinking, like, don't you get into a kind of third man argument paradox problem here, like where there has to be a third system that adjudicates between them?
Yeah, so I'm not sure. There probably are models of like physiologically in the brain, what is determining what wins. But I think that it's a matter of, not a matter of there being a neutral adjudicator, but just that each system is just competing, and whichever is sending the stronger signal wins. Okay. In a situation where there's competing signals. So there could be situations where they're both telling you the same thing, in which case it's going to be irrelevant. You're going to be kind of, both intellectually and in every sense of in every cognitive sense on the same page about something. But yeah. So
okay, that's the second one really quickly. I'm still hung up on Green's sort of approach to deontology, just because you perfectly laid out the irony of Kant as sort of like this big emotional figure. But I am wondering about the fact that Kant's program leads into a certain actions that are actually very emotionally repugnant or difficult to us, right? Like if a society is disintegrating and they have prisoners who have been executed to death left in jail, they have a moral obligation to execute those people, right? Or if you are at the door and someone is upstairs and you know that the person upstairs is being chased by another person, and that person is threatening to kill them, and that person comes to the door, you have a moral obligation not to lie, right? It seems to be those are very clearly...
He says a lot of unintuitive things.
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess what you could say if you're going to try to psychoanalyze Kant is that he started with certain priors that were based on, Green would say his emotions, I would agree with Cushman that it's his model-free system, and that you start theorizing.
Or a model-based system if you think of the fact that he's coming out of German Lutheranism, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So it might be more complicated. But one thing that philosophers end up doing is we bite bullets. So once we have certain commitments, we try to make our theory work. And however you're going to make your theory work, you're going to end up with some weird stuff coming out. So at some point, you just start biting bullets.
So it's the grenade scenario that we were talking about earlier. Do you think that the Army trains you to ignore your model free, or does it build up your model free that you should do that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and I think you would have to ask people who have gone through the training, but I would imagine that they're building up your model free to give a contrasting imperative, but I'm not sure how. It would be interesting to study what is it that people do during the rigors of their military training. Those rigors are rigorous for a reason, because they're actually trying to reshape the way you think. So yeah, that would be interesting to investigate how it is that they do that. or what it is they do.
Does Green really imagine that if we weren't the way we are and we didn't have so much emotion, we could just be calculating machines, that we would be much more morally accurate?
I think so. I think that that's his view. I think he thinks consequentialism is right. And that, now, there's a question, is there an emotional basis for consequentialism itself? So do you have to, like, for example, care for human life? Do you need to have empathy in order to even be a consequentialist? You have to value the outcome of a human life being spared. So if you're a psychopath, then you're not valuing the outcome of saving a human life. So yeah, so that's one of the criticisms of Green, that emotions are arguably implicated in both systems. Now, I would put it a little differently, not that emotions intrinsically are implicated, but that our values are implicated. So each system has to somehow decide what is valuable. And some of those values are going to be innate. So there's some things that as infants we're innately prepared to value, but other things are going to be socially developed as we come to value things via both of these systems.
So let me ask, it seems the deontologist
right.
is guided by a primitive part of the brain, and the consequentialist is guided by a more sophisticated part of the brain. So what you would want is a consequentialist who, in order to act, first has to overcome emotional revulsion. If they don't feel the emotional revulsion, it's a psychopath, right? That seems to be what you were suggesting.
And I'm also asking whether it's necessarily the case that the primitive part is less trustworthy than the sophisticated part. At one point, Aristotle says human beings must be rational because that's unique to human beings,
right.
so we should do it, which I think is just a total failure as an argument.
Right, so we've got...
Unique to birds is that they fly, therefore birds should fly all the time.
Yeah, so there's a criticism that you can make of Green to say, just because having these giant prefrontal cortexes are evolutionarily more novel, that doesn't mean that what they do is better. It's also worth keeping in mind what parts of the brain we kept, because if we keep a part of the brain, it's probably because it's doing something useful. So there's a model that people like to use, that we've got our lizard brain, and then we've got our monkey brain, and we've got our human brain. But there's a criticism of that model to say, actually, if there's something that we have that lizards have, it's probably because it's been useful all this time, and we're probably still using it for a reason. So there's a case to be made that the model-free system, even if it's not as shiny and fancy and distinctly human, it might play an important role in the things that we do.
Also, if you met people who were real moral heroes, who did wonderful things that everyone admires or should admire, is it the case that they decided to do that thing by careful, rational consideration of the alternatives?
Right, so you just introduced virtue ethics, which we've been talking about Aristotle, so why don't we look at our moral exemplars and ask ourselves, what is it our exemplars do?
So, the deontology, you're saying it was always follow the relative rules.
Right.
Hope your emotions kind of help you define your morals in a way.
Yeah, well, so that's actually part of what Green considers to be a critique of Kant. Green thinks that what Kant does is listen to his emotions and basically rationalize what his emotions are telling him, so comes up with a set of rules that are designed to be systematically consistent with his own emotional responses. Now, that's intended to be a critique, but you could turn that around and say, well, maybe we should trust our emotions. Maybe our emotions tell us something about moral reality, if you want to go that far, and say, there is moral truth, our emotions tell us what is morally true. That's another theory that someone could hold.
Because I was thinking about that, and you're saying the deontology would be the one over 5 lives, okay?
one of the
one over, like choosing the one life over the 5 lives.
right.
I'm telling you, but what if, like, if emotions value morals, or emotions shape your morals? What if it was like 1 family member versus 5 prisoners, strangers,
Right.
and you're morally choose to pick family first? So
Right, and that gets to Kareen's point from earlier that I haven't said who these people are. So I deliberately made it abstract, but it's true that once you start to specify who these people are these people family? Are these people friends? Are these people like you? Are these people different from you? Then you're going to end up with people saying much different things, that the responses people give are going to be shaped by the specificities like that.
So would say in the case of deontology, would it change its aspect or its choice based on the details you put in the situation?
Well, it's going to depend a lot on the theory. So some people have deontological theories that we have, for example, specific duties to some people that we don't have towards others. A consequentialist will say it's not a matter of duty, it's a matter of outcome. It's a matter of saving lives, creating the maximum total good, whereas a deontologist might, and again, theories are going to vary drastically among deontologists, but many deontologists would say that we have a greater duty towards some people rather than others. For example, we might have a special duty to our children that we wouldn't have towards other people. So that's one way that a deontologist could justify saving fewer rather than greater number of people.
So you think they could come to an agreement in a situation?
Oh, well, you can come up with specific cases where a consequentialist and a deontologist would agree, but if you want to come up with cases where they disagree, you can do that too. So the transplant case, you're not going to find too many deontologists who are going to agree that you should harvest the organs of innocent bystanders.
Consequentialists who would say that, right?
Well, consequentialists might be forced to. Some consequentialists might say, yes, you should harvest the organs, save more lives, whereas it's going to be pretty hard to find consequentialists who would get on board for that. So I think there really are competing implications of these theories that, again, depend on which flavor of these theories you
I mean, in that situation, you said, because you said consequentialists would always choose the action with the best consequence, and you save 4 lives. So would the deontologist and the consequentialist both agree that you should harvest those organs and save 4 people?
Well, a deontologist might not say that you should save more lives. They might say that a doctor has a duty to patients to first do no harm. So first do no harm is a deontological principle. We don't tell our doctors, do the most good. We say, first do no harm, okay? Which makes a big difference.
Well, if I could add another way to solve this problem, the organ transplant problem is if we evaluate it only on the measure of saving lives, that's one set of values under which the consequence will be, of course, you kill the 1 to save the 5, right? But it's a much more complex scenario. A consequentialist could say, if we think about what the value or loss of value is, if every time you go to the doctor you don't know if you're going to come out because your organs might be harvesting, that the social value of that measured up, if we could put a number on that, is far greater than this particular scenario in which these 4 people live. You see what I'm saying?
Right. So
that would be a
some
consequentialist account.
consequentialists say, on the basis of those kinds of considerations, you should have people follow rules that even if rules aren't in every case going to produce the best outcome, you can choose rules that generally have good outcomes, and that if you have everyone operate without rules, then you just get lots of crazy bad stuff happening. I saw a hand.
Yeah, and the thing with the doctor situation is that comes down to, you're not just going to harvest this person's organs, because it's their body, you have to have them sign a waiver saying, yes, I will give this part up. So it's more of like, hey, we have these 4 people that could use your organs, would you give them up for it? Then that becomes, are they volunteering for it? So you have to now it's no longer on the doctor, it's on the person giving up their organs.
Well, that is due to our deontological regulations.
Yeah.
If you're a thoroughgoing consequentialist, you could say, who cares about these waivers? I want those organs.
So I was thinking, not everyone, it's possible not everyone knows that Louis Finkelman was a rabbi.
Yeah.
And I would think that being a rabbi would make you simultaneously a scholar and a moralist. You'd have to be prepared to moralize. And I would think that your interest in this, you've shown us it turns you into a scholar. But it should make you a moralist too, shouldn't it? To think about these things in depth, but you haven't told us what you think.
Yeah, so my interest in this, my original interest when I'm like putting myself in the shoes of the undergrads is I originally got interested in philosophy because I thought that philosophy was going to tell me what the right thing to do was and to explain why it was the right thing to do. And then I pretty quickly, even as an undergraduate, became like kind of prematurely jaded, and I thought moral theory isn't working, it doesn't tell us what we want to hear, it doesn't tell us anything. So I've become more interested in it as a psychologically, that I'm interested in the psychological processes, I'm interested in the mental processes, I'm interested in the interactions. But if you want to hear why, what I think about ethical theory, then maybe we'll have to get lunch sometime.
I just want to know, would you throw the person off the bridge?
Oh, I wouldn't throw the person off the bridge. But maybe that's just because I'm a wuss.
And he's too big.
We have time for one more question. I don't want to end with Dan admitting that he might be a wuss.
I said I might be a wuss.
Might be a wuss.
Serial murder all up in here.
Any other questions?
Maybe that was just, oh yeah.
Okay.
It's not perfectly formulated, but when you're talking about the cars, the whole idea of robotics, and
Right.
somebody's making a decision, it's okay to save the driver and mow down 50 people. I mean, where's the checks and balances on it? Maybe that's...
Yeah, so this brings up the issue of law, which law is very funny from a philosophical perspective, because philosophers spend literally thousands of years arguing about subtle distinctions without settling everything. And in law, you actually have to settle everything, so they have to stipulate what the right answers are to ethical questions. So from a philosophical standpoint, it's insane, but obviously they have to, because something has to be legal and something has to be illegal. So that means that socially, like as a country, as a world, we are going to decide what self-driving cars are allowed to do and what they're required to do. So there's a political, legislative, legal process that's going to answer those questions. And is it going to give the right answers? That's something that's very tricky, because they have to say something. They have to make some decision. There's no way out of these moral questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you all.